History books have tried to forget a name, and official records have erased it as if it never existed. The name was Florence Burke, and her time in the Virginia highlands left marks that time has not been able to completely erase. The Appalachian Mountains have always kept their secrets. Deep valleys where mist gathers like memories that have been lost, and thick forests where silence is heavier than any confession. Florence made a name for herself in this environment by weaving a web of manipulation that is still hard to understand today. In 1908, Virginia's mountainous region was home to small, isolated communities where families lived far apart and only connected by narrow trails that wound their way between the rocky peaks. Messengers on horseback or travelers who stopped at local taverns would bring news. Florence found the perfect place to work in this remote area, far from the prying eyes of bigger cities and protected by the harsh geography that made any investigation a huge task. She didn't come from those mountains at first. She had come from somewhere in the south with only a worn leather suitcase and a smile that people said could melt the ice of the coldest winter. Early reports say that Florence was a very beautiful woman with hair as dark as a night without a moon and eyes that seemed to see right through people. She moved into a deserted house in County Tazewell. It was a wooden building that had belonged to a family that had left years before, leaving only rumors about why they left so suddenly. People said that Florence fixed up the house with her own hands, turning it into a safe haven that quickly drew attention. She opened an inn to give travelers crossing the mountains, merchants moving goods between towns, and lonely men looking for a place to rest before continuing their journey a place to stay. People in the area quickly heard about Florence's guest house. People said that her home-cooked meals were the best, that her rooms were clean and welcoming, that she was a good conversationalist, and that her stories were interesting. Men of all ages started to show up, some staying for just one night and others for weeks. Florence was great at making each guest feel like they were the only one who really mattered. She really listened to their stories, gave them good advice, comforted those who were sad, and cheered on those who had won. Her magnetic presence made it impossible not to be drawn to her. But all that hospitality made me feel uneasy. The neighbors who lived the closest but still miles away started to notice strange things. Guests came and went a lot, but not many people left. Florence said that many people left before dawn because they wanted to take advantage of the cool morning hours for their trips. She said that some people had chosen to start businesses in far-off cities and had left without warning. The explanation made sense. It was a time when people were always on the move, looking for opportunities in places that were getting farther away. Florence had a special appeal to rich men, like successful merchants, wealthy farmers, and investors who traveled between states looking for cheap land in the mountains. She could pick them out with surgical precision, as if she had a supernatural ability to tell who had money or valuable property. She was never too direct in her approach. Instead, she always made them feel in control while she carefully pulled the invisible threads that brought them closer to her web. Some started to woo her, hoping to marry her and live a peaceful life in those mountains with that interesting woman. No one knew that Florence was slowly changing each of these suitors. She subtly cut them off from each other by saying that the neighbors were gossips, that the nearby towns were dangerous, and that it was better to stay on her property where it was safe. The men started to trust her completely. They told her all about their money, showed her where they kept their savings, and signed papers that Florence had written in perfect handwriting. She knew a lot about property and the law, which was unusual for a woman of that time, especially in such a remote area. People in the Appalachian region knew about Florence Burke's boarding house, but it also became famous in the taverns of Bluefield and the churches of Pocahontas. People started telling scary stories. People saw a merchant go into Florence's boarding house with heavy suitcases, but they never saw him leave. A rich farmer had told the beautiful landlady that he wanted to marry her, but he had vanished without a trace. Families of these men sent letters that went unanswered and asked questions that went unanswered. Florence kept up a perfect front. When she came to town, she always went to church on Sundays, dressed simply but elegantly, and was kind to everyone. She gave money to local charities, did small favors for her neighbors from time to time, and kept her property in great shape. Most people saw her as just an independent and hard-working woman who had made a home for herself in that forgotten part of the mountains. But to those who paid attention and put the pieces together along the winding Appalachian trails, Florence Burke was something much worse. A dark force posing as hospitality. The seasons came and went in the beautiful Virginia mountains, and Florence kept getting guests at her quiet inn. In the winter of 1909, heavy snows blocked the trails for weeks, making the property feel like a world apart from the nearby towns. Florence seemed to thrive during these times of complete isolation, as if the forced solitude fed something inside her that wanted to stay hidden from other people. In polite conversation in the area, the word victim was never used, but there was a ritual to how Florence chose her victims. She looked at, studied, and judged each traveler who knocked on her door with the skill of someone who had turned manipulation into an art form. Not all of her guests interested her. Only those who had certain traits did. For example, lonely men without close family, travelers who said they were moving to a different area, and merchants who talked openly about how they kept their savings safe. Florence had trained ears to hear this important information in what seemed like casual dinner conversations. The house itself seemed to help her with her plans. The old wooden building had narrow hallways that creaked when you walked on them, rooms with heavy doors that blocked out sound, and a deep cellar that was cut right into the mountain rock. Florence knew every loose board, every shadow that was in the right place, and every corner where secrets could be kept safe from prying eyes. The closest neighbors lived so far away that it would be impossible to hear anything coming from the property, even on the quietest days when the wind stopped completely and the mountains held their breath. After a few weeks living with Florence, the men started to change in a certain way. They came with high hopes and plans, but over time, something inside them changed. When they did meet other travelers, they became less talkative and more withdrawn, as if a shadow had fallen over their spirits. Florence had subtle ways of controlling her special guests. She made calming teas with herbs she picked from the mountain slopes, served large meals that made the men sleepy and obedient, and created an atmosphere of almost invisible dependence. Letters were a big part of her plan. Florence had beautiful handwriting and was very good at copying other people's writing. She asked her guests to write letters to their families and told them it was important to stay in touch. She watched closely as they wrote each letter and signed their names. Then, when she needed to, Florence wrote convincing letters that explained changes in plans, new places to go, and long-winded reasons why she wouldn't be able to talk to them in the future. Florence paid a lot of money to people in faraway cities to send these letters, making sure that the postmarks matched the made-up stories. She also had legal papers in her dark arsenal. Florence knew a lot about property laws. She knew exactly which papers needed to be signed to transfer land, how to write wills that looked completely real, and which witnesses to pay off to make sure signatures were real. She had turned bureaucracy into a weapon, using the law itself to shield her bad behavior. Men signed papers thinking they were making smart investments or keeping their money safe, not knowing they were giving everything to Florence. There were secrets in the cellar of the property that should never be revealed. Florence often went down those stone stairs with lanterns that made the damp walls look like they were moving. What happened in that underground area was still a mystery, but the results were clear. People who went down to check on the stored food never came back with the same look on their faces. It was as if they had seen things that were impossible to understand. Florence was always with them, always in charge of what they could see, and always ready to explain any disturbing detail. There were superstitions in the Appalachian region. like stories that had been passed down through generations about mountain spirits and cursed places. Florence took advantage of these beliefs by carefully spreading rumors that her property was built on sacred ground, that she had received blessings from ancient healers, and that she had invisible protections against evil eyes. These stories made people think twice before looking too deeply into her guest house, even if they were curious. In the isolated mountains, where logic often gave way to darker explanations, superstitious fear was a strong ally. Florence also had a network of helpful people in the area who she could call on for help. There was the blacksmith in Richlands who didn't ask any questions about strange tools, the merchant in Tazewell who took goods without asking where they came from, and the dishonest lawyer in Bluefield who verified documents for a lot of money. Everyone in this network only knew bits and pieces of the whole, never enough to understand how big Florence's operations were. She kept them all apart, so no one could put together the creepy puzzle. Florence was especially busy in the winter. People didn't expect to hear from travelers for months because the snow blocked the trails. People accepted that being alone was a normal part of living in that harsh geography. During these times, Florence could work without rushing because she knew that spring was still a long way off and that she had plenty of time to carry out her plans with great care. The howling snowstorms that swept through the Appalachian valleys made all sounds go away, making the property feel like an island cut off from the rest of the world. But Florence never acted on a whim or let her feelings guide her actions. They thought about every move, weighed every decision, and looked at every risk with amazing coldness. She kept detailed records hidden in clever places, like coded notes that only she could read and papers that showed she owned land and assets in different counties. Florence was building a silent empire, getting rich in ways that history books would rather forget. These ways were so dark that even decades later, anyone who found out the truth would feel very uncomfortable. In the spring of 1910, the Appalachian Mountains thawed, revealing landscapes that had been hidden under snow for months. Florence stood on the balcony of her inn and watched as the trails slowly became passable again. She knew that travelers would soon return, bringing new chances for her long-held goals. She had made good use of the winter, building on her successes and getting ready to grow her business beyond the borders of Tazewell County. There was a method to her craziness that was almost genius, but it was genius aimed at evil ends. Florence never stuck to the same patterns. She always changed her plans and adjusted her approach as needed. Some guests just disappeared, while others were seen leaving in the morning, waving goodbye and walking along the winding paths. This inconsistency was planned to make things confusing for anyone who tried to find clear links between events. The mountain's beauty made a great cover for bad things that were going on. There were many places in the deep valleys and thick forests where secrets could be buried and never found. No one else knew the area like Florence did. She had looked into every hidden ravine, natural cave, and depression in the ground where nature was already starting to take back the space with wild plants. She had made geography her friend by using the environment to hide proof of her bad behavior. There was also the issue of personal items. Every guest who stayed at the boarding house left behind personal things like suitcases with clothes, work tools, and important papers. Florence had come up with a good way to deal with these things. Trusted middlemen sold valuable things in secret in far-off cities. At night, when the smoke from the bonfires mixed with the natural mist from the mountains, they burned clothes. She carefully destroyed or changed papers to fit her needs. She planned everything out so that nothing went to waste. In the small community around her property, Florence worked hard to build up the image of a respectable woman. She would sometimes visit families in the area and bring them small gifts like homemade jams or fresh bread. She would also help out when someone got sick and go to the few social events that happened in the area. She needed this fake normalcy to stay alive. It made it hard for people to believe anything bad about them, since they were such an unlikely source. Who would have thought that this nice and helpful woman had such dark secrets? The Appalachian Mountains had their own rhythm and life cycle that had been set in stone generations ago. Florence had perfectly adapted to this rhythm, and her presence no longer seemed strange because she had become such a natural part of the landscape. She knew the merchants who traveled the trails all the time, the farmers who came down from the higher mountains to sell their goods, and the occasional travelers who looked for shorter routes through the rough terrain. She judged everyone who crossed her path, mentally keeping track of them and deciding whether they were a possible target or a possible threat. Florence acted in a way that was cold and planned, not just out of greed. She didn't seem to feel bad about what she did or have any empathy for the people she hurt and used. Her dark eyes never showed any emotion when she carried out her plans. Her hands never shook when she signed fake documents, and her voice stayed calm and beautiful even when she told the biggest lies. It was like there was something missing from her constitution, some basic part of being human that lets normal people feel guilt or regret. The guest house kept getting guests with amazing regularity. Florence's reputation as a great hostess had spread far and wide, and men kept coming, drawn by promises of comfort and hospitality. She kept the rooms spotless, the food was always plentiful and tasty, and the whole place gave off a false sense of safety and welcome. It was a clever trap that looked like a safe place to stay, and it worked very well. Florence was also very good at changing her stories when she needed to. When asked about a past guest, she always had a quick and convincing answer. He had gotten urgent news and left quickly. He had decided to start a business in another state. He had talked about distant relatives who needed help. Every story was different, and every explanation had enough detail to make it seem true without being able to be checked. Florence knew that people were suspicious of lies that were too complicated, but they believed simple and direct lies without question. The basement was still the center of her most evil activities. Florence worked down there for hours, using a lantern to see, with damp stone walls that kept the temperature the same all year round. What she did in that underground space was a mystery that she kept very close to her heart, but the results were clear. Men who went down those stairs often never came back up, and when they did, they seemed to have changed in ways that were hard to put into words but very disturbing. There were almost no local governments in that remote part of the Appalachian. The nearest sheriff was days away, and his area was too big for him to patrol properly. Florence had picked her spot with careful thought, putting herself in a place where the law was more of an idea than a real thing. People worked out their problems with each other, kept their own things safe, and used informal codes of honor instead of formal legal systems. Florence was able to do almost anything she wanted in this lack of authority, but there were people in the mountains who could see patterns even when others couldn't. Hunters who were out in the woods at night saw smoke coming from Florence's chimney at strange times. People who traveled through the area said they saw people moving around the property at night, carrying heavy things that were too dark to see what was inside. These bits of information spread slowly through the small community, planting seeds of doubt that would eventually grow into something more dangerous for Florence. But for now, she went about her business without being bothered, a dark queen in her own kingdom in the Virginia mountains. The Appalachian valleys got very hot in the summer, and a visitor came who would change everything at Florence's boarding house. Thomas was a middle-aged man from Kentucky who had come to the plains to find cheap land to start a lumber business. He had a lot of money saved up, but he also had something that Florence didn't often find in her victims, a natural distrust and a strong sense of danger. Florence could tell right away that Thomas was different from the others. He politely agreed to stay at the guest house, but his sharp eyes noticed things that others missed. How Florence watched her guests during meals, how she casually asked about their families and plans for the future, and how she subtly pushed them to stay longer. Thomas answered with carefully vague words, giving only surface-level information, while keeping his true secrets to himself. It was a game of cat and mouse, and both players knew they were up against a tough opponent. Florence changed her plans when she saw that normal methods wouldn't work with Thomas. She became even more charming by paying more attention to him, cooking special meals, and giving him advice on the best places to invest in timber in the area. But Thomas kept a respectful distance and never let things get too close. During the day, he went on long walks around the property to look at the trails and study the terrain with experienced eyes that could see flaws in the landscape. Florence started to get annoyed with Thomas's walks because they made her feel uneasy. He would come back with questions about certain parts of the property, talk about finding strange holes in the ground that had been covered by new plants, and comment on tools that had been left behind that didn't seem to belong in the woods. Florence was good at changing the subject, but she could feel her grip on the situation slipping away. Thomas was putting together things that shouldn't be connected and seeing patterns that should have been hidden by time and neglect. As the days went by, the tension in the boarding house became more and more real. Other guests noticed that there was something strange going on between Florence and Thomas. They would look at each other for a long time without saying anything, and conversations would stop as soon as someone walked into the room. Florence started to think about things she usually only thought about when she really needed to, but Thomas always seemed to be one step ahead, never fully letting his guard down and always keeping escape routes open. The nights were getting more and more tense. Florence found out that Thomas had been locking his bedroom door with heavy furniture when she tried to see if he was sound asleep. Thomas heard the furniture creaking as it was moved and quickly lit a lamp. He then asked through the locked door if anything was wrong. Florence made up an excuse about hearing strange noises and wanting to make sure the guests were safe, but she knew Thomas wouldn't believe her. It got really bad when Thomas said he was leaving the next day and that he had found a good place to live far away. Florence tried to get him to stay longer by offering big discounts and suggesting they look into other possible business locations together. But Thomas stuck to his guns, and there was something in his eyes that made it clear that he knew more about Florence than she wanted to admit. Florence made a special dinner for Thomas that last night and served him wine from her own cellar. Thomas took the glass with a polite smile, but Florence saw that he only wet his lips and didn't drink. When he thought she wasn't looking, he quietly poured the drink into a nearby plant pot. Their game had turned into a silent battle of wills, with every move planned and every gesture full of hidden meaning. Florence stayed up all night in her room, listening to the sounds of the old house. She knew Thomas was awake too. He was probably sitting in a chair by the locked door, waiting for dawn. Florence felt something like real frustration for the first time in years. Here was someone who could get away from her, someone who might take suspicion with him when he left, and someone who could plant dangerous ideas in people's minds that had been ignorant until then. When dawn came, a thick fog covered the valleys like a white blanket. Thomas came out of his room fully dressed and with his suitcase already packed. It was clear that he hadn't slept at all. Florence served breakfast in a tense silence, and they both knew that there were unspoken meanings behind every move. Thomas ate quickly, keeping his eyes open all the time. When Florence offered to pack food for his trip, he politely declined. When it was time for Thomas to leave, he paid for his stay with exactly the right amount of coins, without the extra kindness that guests usually show. He thanked them for their hospitality in a cold, formal way, picked up his suitcase, and walked toward the main trail without looking back. Florence watched from her balcony as he walked away into the morning fog, a lone figure lost in the mountain's white haze. She knew she had lost that fight, but the war was far from over. Florence spent days going over every conversation and every word exchanged in her head, figuring out how much damage Thomas could do. She thought about sending messages through her network of contacts to find Thomas and stop any threats he might pose, but she decided against it because she knew that going after someone so careful would only make him more suspicious. She thought it was better to let him go and hope that her doubts stayed that way, doubts that had not been confirmed. The thing that happened with Thomas affected Florence in ways that went beyond just a tactical loss. For the first time, she had talked to someone who really saw her, who looked past her friendly face and saw the darkness behind it. It was an uncomfortable reminder that no matter how careful she was, there would always be the chance that she would meet someone who was too smart, too careful, or too much of a survivor to fall for her complicated traps. And this made Florence paranoid, and that paranoia grew over the next few months, changing how she acted in small ways. In the fall of 1911, the mountains were painted in shades of copper and gold, turning the Appalachian landscape into a colorful tapestry that stood out sharply from the darkness that filled Florence's boarding house. After her meeting with Thomas, she became more careful and chose her victims with even stricter standards. She also watched them for longer periods of time before acting. The paranoia he had planted had grown into constant watchfulness that even someone as strong-minded as Florence couldn't handle. People kept coming, but Florence noticed that the way they looked at her changed slightly. Some looks were more hesitant, some questions seemed to have more weight, and some silences lasted a second longer than they should have. It's possible that Thomas told someone about his doubts, or maybe it was just Florence's mind playing tricks on her, making threats where there were none. No matter what the reason, she felt like invisible walls were slowly closing in on her. Florence chose to do more than just run the inn. She did things that would make her less likely to be suspected of anything. She started trading land, buying small pieces of land from farmers who were having trouble paying their bills and slowly building up her territory. These deals were completely legal and well documented, which gave her shady business dealings an air of legitimacy. Florence was building a real estate empire that would protect her from future investigations and be a good investment. There was also the issue of her strange past. Florence never talked about her life before she moved to Appalachia. She was very good at changing the subject when someone tried to bring it up, but people started to wonder in faraway taverns and at random community events. Some people said she had run away from an abusive marriage, while others said she had gotten her money through shady means. Some people even said that Florence wasn't her real name. These guesses, which were not always based on real facts, made things seem mysterious, which kept her safe and made her more vulnerable. The seasons kept changing, and Florence learned to deal with each one like a seasoned predator. When the trails became too difficult in the winter, she focused on making the most of her gains and planning her next moves. When more people started traveling in the spring, she started working again, but with more care. Florence took advantage of the opportunities that came her way in the summer and fall, always weighing the risks and rewards of each action and always thinking about what might happen as a result. Florence's network of contacts that she had built up over the years started to show signs of weakness. The blacksmith in Richlands, who never asked questions, died suddenly, taking with him secrets that would never be known. The crooked lawyer in Bluefield was arrested for fraud that had nothing to do with Florence, but his arrest left her without a key middleman for shady legal papers. Every loss in the network made it weaker, leaving a hole that needed to be filled or avoided in other ways. Florence also had to deal with the growing problem of keeping up appearances while doing more and more dangerous things. She kept going to community events now and then, keeping up the appearance of being respectable, which became harder to do as time went on. People wanted to know more about her businesses and investments, and they wanted to know how a single woman could get rich and own property in a place where even whole families were having trouble making ends meet. The basement was still her secret hideout, a place where she could work without being seen and without having to keep up the appearance of being normal all the time. She spent more and more time down there, where the stone walls kept secrets without judging them. The underground space had become an extension of her own mind, a safe place where she could be herself without having to follow the rules of society. But Florence had to pay a price for living a double life. Even for someone as independent as she was, the loneliness started to get to her. No one could share her real victories with her. No one could understand how complicated her plans were, and no one could appreciate how clever her manipulations were. Florence was alone in a deeper way than just not having anyone to talk to. She was alone because she had secrets that she kept so tightly that they became a mental prison. Florence started to see the mountains around her property in a different way. They looked less like friends and more like silent witnesses. The eternal peaks that had seen her actions over the years now seemed to judge her, watching with a coldness that was more disturbing than any human condemnation. Florence found herself looking at the rocky slopes more and more often, wondering how many secrets those old formations had seen, and how many dark stories were hidden under layers of soil and plants. When 1912 came, the area started to change in small ways. More and more people began to hike the Appalachian trails, and the outside world slowly made its way into even the most remote parts of the mountains. Florence saw these changes with growing worry, knowing that forces she couldn't fully control were slowly making their way into her isolated world. Slowly, but surely, progress was starting to reach even that forgotten place where she had built her shadowy empire. New neighbors moved into homes that were not too far away, mostly young families looking for cheap land and new chances. Florence welcomed them with carefully planned hospitality, offering help and advice and building friendly relationships that served as extra cover. But every new resident brought with them a new pair of eyes and ears that could hear dangerous rumors and witnesses who could eventually connect dots that should stay separate. The stress that had built up started to show itself in small ways. Florence didn't sleep as much because her mind was always working on different scenarios and plans, weighing risks and planning exits. She started doing things that made her nervous that she had never done before, like checking doors multiple times at night, jumping at unexpected sounds, and looking over her shoulder too often. The calm and control mask she had always worn started to show tiny cracks that only Florence could see. Spring brought storms that hit the mountains with unusual force, as if nature was mirroring the growing chaos in Florence's life. Lightning lit up the night sky, making it look like it was day for a short time. The thunder was so loud that it shook the walls of the boarding house. Florence stayed up during these stormy nights, listening to the sounds of the storm and feeling like the universe was working against her to reveal secrets she had kept so well. During one of these storms, a new guest showed up, drenched and looking for a place to stay. His name was William, and he came from a faraway place with only a small backpack and the look of someone who had lost everything. Florence greeted him with her usual warmth, offering him dry clothes and a hot meal. But there was something about that man that made her curious in a different way. He wasn't wealthy like her other victims. He didn't own a lot of property or have a lot of savings. However, there was something in his eyes that made her think he had stories to tell. William was a great talker. He told long, interesting stories about faraway places he had been, interesting people he had met, and experiences that were hard to believe. Florence was really interested and paid more attention to his stories than she usually did to guests. There was something freeing about just talking without thinking about how to manipulate the other person, about letting yourself have a real human connection without any ulterior motives. It felt strange and a little unsettling for someone who had made manipulation an art form. William stayed at the boarding house for weeks, working for free to pay for his stay when he ran out of money. He fixed broken fences, patched up roofs that leaked, and took care of the garden with surprising care. Florence let him stay, which she had never done before, with a guest who didn't help her do bad things. It was strange how William's presence made things better. It was like his honesty and simplicity were a needed contrast to the constant darkness that surrounded Florence. But the peace wouldn't last long. Rumors started to spread through the area with new strength. Rumors about men who came to Florence's inn and never came back. A farmer who lived nearby said he found personal items buried in the woods that looked like they belonged to travelers. Another neighbor said they saw Florence digging in the yard behind the inn in the middle of the night, working by lantern light with a feverish determination. The noose around Florence's neck was getting tighter and tighter. She worked harder to look normal, went to more community events, gave a lot of money to local causes, and helped families in need. But every time she tried to avoid suspicion, it seemed to draw more attention, as if her desperate attempt to be normal was itself suspicious. It was a cruel twist of fate. The more she tried to blend in, the more she stood out. William started to ask questions. During his time on the property, he had noticed small inconsistencies that didn't mean much on their own, but added up to a disturbing picture. Why was the cellar always locked? What was it about certain parts of the property that made Florence want to work alone? Why were some of the guest house rooms never used, even though they were well furnished? He asked his questions with innocent curiosity, and there was no clear accusation, but Florence knew they were dangerous. Things got complicated between Florence and William, and there were a lot of unspoken tensions. She knew she should stay away from him because he was a danger she couldn't afford, but there was something about William that kept her there. Maybe it was the last spark of humanity that still existed, buried under layers of cultivated malice. He was a sign of a different life, a different path that Florence had given up on so long ago that she could barely remember what it was like to live without always figuring out angles and changing things around. Florence's nights turned into times of painful thinking. She would stay up at night thinking about the choices she had made and whether there was a time when she could have made a different one. But Florence always ended her thoughts the same way. She remembered that she couldn't go back, that she had crossed lines that couldn't be uncrossed, and that she had done things that would stay with her forever. She couldn't afford to feel bad about things. It would be a weakness that could kill her in her dangerous situation. William finally said he had to go, but he never made it clear where he was going. Florence felt a mix of relief and regret that she couldn't explain. She made sure he had everything he needed for his trip, including enough food for several days and even some coins, which he initially turned down but later accepted with thanks. They stood on the inn's porch that morning, looking at the mountains covered in morning mist. Before leaving, William turned to Florence and said something that would stay with her for a long time. He said that he saw darkness in her, but he also saw a spark of something more, something that could still be saved if she decided to change her mind. He spoke without judging, with real compassion that Florence didn't expect and didn't know how to deal with. She didn't say anything, just nodded as he walked away down the trail, a lone figure slowly disappearing into the vast Appalachian landscape. Florence felt very uneasy after William left. For the first time in years, she wondered if it was worth it to keep going down the path she had chosen. She wondered if the money she made through shady means was really worth being completely alone and always on edge. But her cold, practical nature quickly pushed these doubts out of her mind. There wasn't really a choice or a good option. Florence was stuck in the life she had made for herself, just like any victim was stuck in the lies she had told. The mountains stayed silent, watching the human drama unfold on their slopes without taking sides. Florence went back into the guest house and shut the door behind her with a loud bang. She went back to her usual routine of always being on the lookout and being careful with things. The moment of weakness was over, and she was more determined than ever to keep her secrets safe and stay in charge of the domain she had worked so hard to build. But something had changed at its core, an unseen crack in the foundation that would have effects that even Florence, with all her cleverness, couldn't see or stop. The summer of 1913 brought unbearable heat that turned the valleys of the Appalachians into natural furnaces. The thick, heavy air felt like it had more than just moisture in it. There was an unseen electrical tension that made the animals in the forest act strangely. Florence could feel the change in the air around her. It was as if the mountains were holding their breath before something that was going to happen slowly but surely. That summer, fewer people stayed at the guest house. Rumors had spread farther than Florence had thought, giving the city a reputation that scared off cautious visitors. People who still showed up were usually desperate and had few options, or they were just morbidly curious about the dark stories that were going around. Florence got used to this new reality and became even more picky, only choosing people whose absence would go completely unnoticed in the outside world. Florence worked in a completely different way. Now, the overconfident attitude she had as a child had turned into nervous caution, and she thought about every action she took many times before doing it. She had set up a complicated system of checks and counterchecks to make sure that each move left as few traces as possible and that each transaction could be explained in a legal way if necessary. It was like watching a predator get old and slow down, but make up for it with years of experience that made them smarter. During this time, the basement became even more important to her work. Florence started using it not only for its usual purposes, but also as a careful record of papers and proof that would protect her if she was confronted. She kept copies of all property deals, fake letters that made up long stories, and even signed statements from bribed witnesses that backed up her versions of events that were not clear. It was a paper fortress to keep her safe from future accusations. Florence got an unexpected visitor during that hot summer that changed the fragile balance she had worked so hard to keep. A man came in a fancy carriage and dressed in fine clothes that were very different from the simple, rustic style of the area. He said he was a private investigator who had been hired by a distant relative of one of Florence's former guests who had gone missing without a trace. His presence posed a different kind of threat. It was no longer just rumors and whispers, but a full investigation with resources and determination. Florence welcomed the investigator with open arms, offering him iced tea and leading him to the living room, which she always kept spotless for visitors like this. He asked a lot of detailed questions about the guest in question, showing Florence a blurry picture and asking her to confirm that she knew the man. She looked at the picture with fake interest, frowning as if she were trying to remember, and then she gently said she hadn't seen that person. Her performance was perfect, and her voice stayed in a sympathetic tone for a worried family. It wasn't easy to change the investigator's mind. He spent days in the area, talking to neighbors, looking through local records when he could find them, searching trails, and exploring the land around Florence's property. She watched him from her balcony, acting like she was okay with what he was doing while secretly weighing the risks and making plans for what to do if things went wrong. Every step the investigator took was mentally tracked, and every conversation he had with neighbors was looked at for possible harm. The nights turned into times of anxious waiting. Florence stayed awake, listening to noises from the house and the forest around it. She thought about how her carefully planned operation could fall apart at any moment. She thought about a number of desperate options, such as leaving the property and running away to a faraway place where she could start over. But she had put decades of work into that place and had wealth tied to properties she couldn't just leave without raising even more suspicion. The investigator eventually left without finding enough solid proof to take legal action, but his visit had a lasting effect. Florence knew that it was only a matter of time before more investigations began, and each one could be more thorough than the last. The web she had worked so hard to weave over the years was starting to show signs of weakness, places where threads could be pulled, which would cause the whole thing to fall apart. Florence made the decision during those tense weeks after the investigator left. She would slowly start shutting down her riskiest operations and only work on legitimate business ventures that would make her look respectable. The guest house would stay open, but it would only be a normal business with no shady dealings going on behind the scenes. It was a strategic retreat, a silent admission that it was no longer possible to keep doing things the way she had been. But Florence found it harder to pull out than she had thought. There was the practical problem of dealing with the evidence that had built up over the years, documents that could get her in trouble, and things that linked her to past disappearances. Florence spent nights burning papers in the fireplace, turning years of careful records into ashes that she spread over the gardens. Each destroyed document was like a piece of her past being erased, as if she were slowly erasing her own life. The cleaning went all the way down to the basement, where so many secrets had been kept. Florence worked carefully, getting rid of anything that could be used against her and sealing off areas she never wanted to be able to get to again. It was hard work, both physically and mentally, to carry the weight of years of questionable actions, both literally and figuratively. When she was done, the basement was empty, except for basic supplies and common storage items. It had gone from being the nerve center of criminal activity to a simple, useful space. People who had known Florence for a long time could see the changes in her. She looked like she had aged years in just a few months. Her hair had gray strands that had never been there before, and her face had deep lines that made it look like it had always been young. The burden of keeping secrets and being paranoid all the time was getting to him, and it showed in ways that even all the willpower in the world couldn't hide. Florence was becoming a shadow of herself, a weaker version of the confident predator who had once ruled those mountains. Florence, on the other hand, stayed on guard even when she was retreating. She knew that the past never really went away, and that there was always a chance that some evidence she had forgotten about would come to light. A witness would show up, or a determined investigator would finally put together the pieces she had worked so hard to keep apart. She had to deal with this uncertainty for the rest of her life, and it had replaced the arrogance she had felt in the past with a resigned acceptance of always being vulnerable. The mountains kept watch, silent and timeless, keeping secrets that might never be fully revealed but would also never be completely forgotten. In the fall, cold winds came down from the mountains, bringing signs of change that couldn't be stopped. Florence watched the leaves fall from the trees around her house. Each one reminded her that everything comes to an end, no matter how hard she tried to keep things under control. The inn was now running in a completely legal way, welcoming travelers who paid for honest lodging and left without any problems. It was almost like normal life, except that Florence had to deal with the heavy burden of her past every waking moment. It was cruelly ironic that forced respectability had turned into its own prison. Florence learned that being law-abiding required a different kind of discipline than working in the shadows. She had to always keep up appearances, smile at annoying guests, put up with boring conversations about boring things, and pretend to be interested in the lives of regular people. It was an exhausting show that never ended, and she had to stay in character the whole time. The neighbors slowly started to let go of their doubts. Old rumors lost their power because there were no new strange events, and Florence was acting perfectly normal. People forget things quickly when they have to deal with the same boring things every day. The sad rumors about the boarding house were slowly replaced by more pressing issues. Florence thought that this easing of tension was a kind of freedom, but she knew she could never really let her guard down. Florence started to think deeply about the direction her life had taken during this time of seeming peace. She thought about important times when different decisions could have led to different futures, paths that could have brought her real happiness instead of money that came from shady means. These thoughts didn't help. They only made me feel like I had missed out on chances and that my humanity was slowly fading away because of years of manipulation and malice. That fall, loneliness got worse. Florence realized that the walls she had built around herself were so high that they were almost impossible to break down. She couldn't have a real conversation with anyone because no one knew her whole story and still chose to be there. She had worn masks for so long that she had forgotten what it was like to be a real person, instead of always playing the role of a person. The mountains that had once seemed like friends now seemed like witnesses who were accusing him. Florence didn't want to look at the far-off peaks. She wanted to keep her eyes on the ground right around her. It was strange to think that those old rock formations had seen everything, held all of her dark secrets, and would still be there long after she was gone. Florence didn't want this kind of immortality. Memories kept alive in the stony silence of the eternal mountains. Florence got an unexpected letter on a very cold day in November. It was from William, the guest who had left months before, and left her with words that haunted her. He had written to tell her that he had moved to a faraway town, found honest work, and the peace he had been looking for so long. But what really moved Florence was his honest offer of friendship, his suggestion that she come over whenever she wanted, and his promise that there would always be a place for her at his table if she wanted to start over. The letter brought up feelings that Florence thought she had buried a long time ago. She read and reread what William wrote, feeling a mix of hope and pain. She wanted to believe that she could start over and leave everything behind to build a new life in a new place. But another part, shaped by years of cold realism, knew that running away wouldn't change the past, and that shadows would always follow her, no matter how far she went. Florence kept the letter in a wooden box with a few other things that were very personal to her. It made her think about another option, a road she could have taken if she had been a different person. But she didn't say anything to William. She didn't want to ruin his new life by being around someone who had too much dark baggage to share. Florence did a rare act of kindness. She protected someone by not being there instead of being there. The next few weeks were a blur of mechanical tasks. Florence ran the guest house like a pro, greeted guests with warmth, and kept the place spotless. But her actions seemed empty, like she was a robot following a program without really being involved. The spark that used to make Florence come alive, even if it was a bad one, was gone, leaving only a shell that worked. That year, winter came early and brought snow that covered the mountains sooner than expected. Florence spent hours looking out the window at the landscape, which had turned into a uniform white. She thought about how snow hid everything for a while, but eventually melted and revealed buried truths. It was a good metaphor for her own life. Secrets hidden by time and distance that would come out when the right conditions were met. Florence made a choice that would change her last years forever during one of those quiet afternoons of thinking. She would start writing down her own story, not as a confession for others to read, but as a way to face the truth about her life. It would be a painful exercise in being honest with herself, which she had avoided doing for most of her adult life. Florence started writing in a leather notebook, filling it with memories and thoughts that she would never tell anyone else. Writing was both helpful and painful at the same time. Every word she wrote on paper made Florence face the truth about the choices she had made, the lives that had been affected by her actions, and the darkness she had grown inside herself. When she was alone in her quiet room, with no one to impress or manipulate, there was no way to make the truth sound better. It was just Florence and her conscience, maybe for the first time since she started going down the wrong path years ago. The pages built up slowly, with each entry going deeper into a mind that Florence would have rather left alone. She wrote about her first days at the boarding house, the slow choices that led her down darker paths, and the excuses she made to keep going even when she knew she was crossing lines that couldn't be crossed back. These pages didn't offer forgiveness, they just showed that the writer was responsible and that nothing could change that. As winter got worse, Florence kept writing, filling her notebook with secrets that no one else would ever read. The snow-covered mountains stood still, watching as something changed inside the lonely inn. Florence was going through changes that she didn't fully understand. She was facing the truth, which led to what could be called redemption, though she would never use such a presumptuous word to describe her journey. Winter seemed to be holding on to the mountains for a long time, so spring 1914 came late in the Appalachians. During the cold months, Florence finished her notebook of confessions, filling each page with harsh truths she never thought she would have the strength to face. Writing had changed something deep inside her. Not forgiveness or absolution, but at least an honest admission of who she had become over the years. It was a small start to what could one day be called peace, but Florence knew that real peace would probably always be out of her reach. Florence made an unexpected choice when spring came. She started to give away her property slowly. She sold land to families in the area for very low prices and gave away plots to the community to build a school and other public spaces. These were not acts of kindness meant to buy forgiveness. Florence knew that some things couldn't be undone by being nice later on, but they were practical ways for someone to leave the world with less weight than she had carried during her life. The neighbors were surprised and grateful, but they were also cautious. Families who were having a hard time making a living in the mountains suddenly had chances that had seemed impossible before. Florence didn't want people to know about or thank her for these gifts. She made them quietly, through legal intermediaries, keeping the emotional distance that had always been a part of her interactions. It was as if she was taking apart the empire she had built piece by piece, getting ready for it to end. The guest house stayed open, but Florence only let people in who really needed help. Travelers without money could stay for free, families in need could get free meals, and people who were on the fringes of society and would have been turned away by other places were welcomed without judgment. Florence never said why she changed, but she acted with a quiet kindness that confused people who remembered the bad things people said about her in the past. Florence often walked the mountain trails she had avoided before during those months of slow change. She walked through the deep valleys where mist hung like memories, climbed steep hills to see huge views that made her feel very small in the grand scheme of things. The mountain talked to her in ways it never had before, not with words, but with a presence that was almost accepting, if not forgiving. Knowing that her past actions would never be completely erased or explained made things strangely clear. Florence didn't try to avoid responsibility by doing nice things late, and she didn't try to convince herself that good things now made up for bad things in the past. She was brutally honest with herself, which helped her deal with the contradictions in her life. She could admit the bad things she had done and the small amount of good she could still do in the years she had left. Florence was the only one who knew where the notebook of confessions was. She sometimes added pages with her thoughts on the process of change and the things that made it hard for her to change. There were times when old urges came back, tempting me to go back to the old ways of manipulating and controlling people. Florence wrote about these struggles honestly, not as someone who couldn't help but give in to her urges, but as someone who was aware of what she was doing and making conscious choices to fight urges she had once fully embraced. The seasons went on, as they always do, and Florence started a new routine that was based on simplicity and usefulness. She worked in a garden that she had carefully planted, growing vegetables that she gave to her neighbors. She fixed things for people who couldn't afford to hire professionals. She sat on her porch for long afternoons, looking at the mountains and letting herself have quiet moments that she used to think were a waste of time. Sometimes, visitors would come and disturb this carefully built peace. Investigators still came by from time to time, asking questions about old disappearances and looking for links that might finally prove long-held suspicions. Florence accepted them with calm resignation, giving answers that were only partly true and didn't reveal anything that could get her in trouble. She was able to keep a delicate balance between being honest and protecting herself because she had practiced it for years. During one of these visits, a very persistent investigator showed evidence that almost linked Florence to a specific disappearance. He had papers that showed problems with property transfers, testimonies from people who remembered disturbing details, and pieces of letters that made things even more complicated. Florence listened to everything with a blank look on her face. She didn't say yes or no, but she didn't say anything at all, which was both an admission and a technical denial. The investigator eventually left without finding enough solid evidence to take legal action, but Florence knew she was living on borrowed time. It was only a matter of luck or hard work before someone finally found enough proof to make a strong case. This certainty, oddly enough, gave me a strange sense of peace. Florence was no longer afraid of being exposed like she used to be. In fact, a part of her may have even wanted a clear end to the constant uncertainty. The nights turned into times when I thought a lot about my legacy and memories. Florence thought about what people would say about her after she died, and what stories would spread about the mysterious woman who had lived alone in the mountains. She thought that history books would leave out her name on purpose, because they would rather forget than face the uncomfortable truths about human nature that her life showed. It was poetic justice that this erasure happened. Florence knew of a better way to punish someone than a formal trial could. Summer came, and the heat made the air ripple over the slopes of the mountains. Florence kept being quietly generous and honest in her work, living each day as if it could be her last before the past finally caught up with her. She had learned to accept the end of things in a way that went beyond just giving up. It was a realization that all stories come to an end, and that even the most well-kept secrets will eventually come to light. Florence would sit on the porch with a cold lemonade on warm afternoons and watch travelers go by on distant trails. She stopped talking about the guest house like she used to, letting it slowly go back to being a place that no one knew about, just like it had been years ago. The mountains kept watch, not caring about the human drama that was happening on their slopes. They were constant reminders that even the most disturbing stories eventually faded away into dust and broken memories. Florence had accepted a level of simplicity that she would have thought was impossible before. She got a strange sense of satisfaction from doing boring things, talking to people without hidden agendas, and being alone when she didn't have to think about angles or plan how to manipulate them. It was a life very different from the one she had lived for so long. It didn't erase the past, but it did give her the chance to live with a purpose beyond just surviving and getting more. The mountains stood silent and eternal, keeping secrets that Florence knew the wind would eventually tell through the valleys. These stories would never completely die, but with enough time, they might change into vague legends with no faces or names. The years that followed went by like leaves blowing through the Appalachian valleys. Florence kept living her changed life, and every day was a silent exercise in living with memories that she could never fully let go of. The guest house was still open, but it was no longer the same place. It used to be a quiet place where a few travelers could rest without any drama or mystery. The woman who had lived among the mountains for so long slowly changed over time. Florence got older with quiet grace. Her hair turned completely gray, and her body lost the strength it used to have. She didn't fight these changes because she knew they were a normal part of the cycle that everyone would eventually go through. She no longer felt rushed. She just calmly accepted the time that was left. Florence often stopped to look at the landscapes she had known for so long while walking along familiar trails. These included the rocky slopes, the thick forests, and the deep valleys where mist gathered on cool mornings. While everything else stayed the same, she was changing in ways that could never be undone. The mountains were always the same, which was strangely comforting. They reminded me that there are things bigger and more permanent than the little dramas of human life. The notebook of confessions had grown over the years, with pages filled with thoughts and memories that Florence wrote down with brutal honesty. She finally decided to burn the notebook after she died, not because she was ashamed, but because she knew that some truths were only for her own confrontation and didn't need an audience. Florence's last act of control was to choose which parts of her story would live on and which would die with her. The people in the area slowly forgot the old stories about the boarding house and its strange owner. New residents came without knowing the dark stories that used to be told, and longtime residents let uncomfortable memories fade as they focused on more important things. Florence had become part of the scenery, a familiar but not very noticeable presence, just like she wanted. There were times of deep loneliness in those last years. Florence would sit alone on her porch at night, listening to the sounds of the forest and letting herself feel the full weight of the loneliness she had built around herself. But she didn't feel sorry for herself during these times. They were just the natural results of choices she had made decades before. She didn't want company or comfort. She had come to terms with being alone for the rest of her life. The seasons kept going in their usual way, with each spring bringing new life that Florence grew to appreciate more and more. She planted flowers that she would never have thought of before. Simple beauty, with no purpose other than to exist. She fed the birds that came to her property and watched them with interest because she finally had time to notice the small things in nature around her. Florence thought about William and his offer of friendship that he never answered from time to time. She thought that he had made a good life for himself somewhere far away, maybe with family and friends that Florence had never let herself have. There was no regret in this thought, only an understanding of the different paths that lives can take and the choices that shape destinies in ways that can't be changed. The Appalachians held Florence's secrets, just like they held the secrets of many other people who lived and died on their slopes over the years. The mountains didn't judge or forgive. They just stood there and watched as human dramas played out, only to fade away into the mists of time and forgetfulness. Florence found comfort in the fact that nature didn't care about her problems. It reminded her that even the most disturbing stories lost their power over time. Florence began to consciously get ready for the end as the years went by. She made her life even simpler by giving away her last few things and making sure that her inn would go to someone who would use it for good. These weren't big acts of redemption. They were just practical things a person did to get their affairs in order before leaving. Florence didn't think that being kind after being mean made up for being mean in the past, but at least it would keep her from ruining the future. The mountains stayed the same through all of this. They were eternal peaks that watched with infinite patience as Florence finished a journey that had begun so many years ago under such different circumstances. She looked at those old rocks and knew they would be the last to see her. They held memories that no history book would ever tell, dark stories that would stay hidden under layers of time and silence. In the shadows of the Appalachians, where mists covered deep valleys and winds whispered through old forests, the story of Florence Burke slowly faded into vague legend and forgotten rumors. History books never wrote down her name because they didn't want to deal with the uncomfortable truths about how dark people can be. The mountains kept their secrets as they always had. Time kept moving forward, turning clear memories into vague shadows until only silence was left where such a disturbing presence had once been.